professor called Dory Laub, who is a psychiatrist himself and a Holocaust survivor, co-founds the Holocaust Survivors Film Project, where he films conversations and develops a technique of empathetic listening that has become central to how we understand the criteria of witnessing and accompaniment in the work of post-traumatic remaking. It has a significant impact then on how we in the West imagine trauma, which has largely been framed through this lens of the Holocaust, which is obviously a particularly white European form of trauma experience. This shift towards paying attention to men and trauma does continue and is intensified in the US particularly through decades of conflict in Asia, firstly the Korean War and then the Vietnam War, which sees whole generations of men traumatized by their time spent in these war zones. And as these men are coming home from war, we get the beginnings of recognition of other events as similarly traumatic starting to take root. So in the 1960s and 70s, the feminist movement helps people see the extent of violence against women as a routine part of women's sexual and domestic lives. Many battered women, it's the language Herman uses there, had similar post-traumatic experiences and trauma symptoms as the men who'd come home from Vietnam. And this led first into rape law reform, so that rape becomes a crime of violence rather than a sexual act, and then research into sexual assault, domestic violence, and sexual abuse of children. There are other ways of telling this story of trauma in the last 150 years or so, but when we're thinking about this from the perspective of women, I find Herman's gendered kind of reading of this just really helpful to see that, it takes almost 100 years before anyone's really making the connections between what men have experienced and what women are experiencing. Next slide, please. So the impact of trauma on an individual results in 3 ruptures that have profound and ongoing significance. If you want to, you can turn to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is the psychiatrist's handbook, and in there you will find a very detailed account of PTSD. That detailed account of PTSD is heavily shaped by American nationalism and by the American healthcare industry, which has a vested interest in who gets diagnosed with this kind of thing. So I never use the PTSD definition, it's not a neutral one. I talk about this in terms of 3 ruptures. It also helps me keep some distance from medical language. These 3 ruptures then are a rupture in bodily integrity, a rupture in the experience of time, and a rupture in language and cognition. Taken together, they indicate why the experience of trauma can be so devastating to the individual and why the impacts of trauma can be so long-lasting. The first rupture, that of bodily integrity, is perhaps the easiest to grasp. It may be really obvious the ways in which a body is violated. It might be through a bullet, it might be in a rape, it might be the damage caused to a body through natural disaster. All of these experiences rupture the integrity, the wholeness of the body. But of course, many experiences of traumatic events don't involve such obvious violations. In the experience of coercive control or spiritual abuse, as we've just heard from Selina, what is violated is the mind, which is, of course, a part of the body. This rupturing of bodily integrity can often result in the individual feeling like they're very disconnected from their body. They might recognize that their body is very vulnerable and that their body is no longer a safe place. The second one, then, the second rupture, is found in the ways in which the traumatized person experiences time. The experience of a traumatic event may have passed, but the past continues to invade into the present and make itself known through nightmares and flashbacks and hallucinations. These experiences are uncanny, and the person who's experienced trauma may find themselves reenacting or reliving the trauma experience repeatedly. Such experiences serve to emphasize the extent to which the body has been violated by this trauma and can exacerbate feelings that the body is out of control. The third rupture then is that of language and cognition, and these 2 elements are put together because it is through language that we come to understanding. So language and cognition go together. And in the experience of trauma, the event itself often becomes inaccessible to the person who's experienced trauma. They might have no memory of what happened to them, or they might grasp at different elements of the narrative at different times, assembling the pieces of the story like a jigsaw puzzle. The person who's experienced trauma may lack the language to articulate their experience, highlighting a disconnect between memory and language. So all three of those ruptures highlight the great significance of the body in the experience of trauma, regardless of what the actual experience of trauma is. There's a wealth of research on this, but people who've experienced trauma are much more likely to develop autoimmune diseases and are much more likely to develop chronic health conditions. Entirely entwined. Trauma can impact on memory, concentration, ability to learn new things, the ability to focus. It can cause raised cortisol and adrenaline levels. And from an epigenetic perspective, trauma can be passed on to successive generations. So those embodied responses can be found second, third, fourth, and even further on. We've seen that not just in generations descended from Holocaust survivors, but also of generations descended from indigenous peoples who experienced forced and violent colonization, and those descended from African slaves in the Americas, amongst many other communities. Part of my current research is thinking about this in relationship to the question of original sin. I'm not going to talk about that now, but I'm really happy to talk about that another time if that's interesting. So, there's a gendered nature to the legacy of trauma, and there's also a deeply embodied element to it as well. Paying attention to experience in and of the body is a hallmark of the commitments of feminist theologies. And when it comes to thinking particularly about trauma in theology, this feminist trajectory continues. Can I have the next slide, please? Trauma theologian Shelley Rambo, who's based at Boston University and is usually considered to be someone who's a founder in the field of trauma theology, notes the following. This and the next slide both come from the Introduction to Feminist Trauma Theologies, which might be on the back table, so if you want to read more, you can. But Rambo says this: there was no such thing as trauma theology when she started doing her PhD research. Within Christian theology, Rebecca Chopp, Flora Keshkegian, Serene Jones, all wonderful women you should absolutely read, each of them steeped in feminist and liberation theologies, began to integrate these studies of trauma from literary scholars and psychoanalysts and historians into their work. Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery, which we just talked about, published in 1992 and now a classic in the field, presented trauma as a decidedly political and feminist issue. Most theologians working with early trauma theories were women and espoused feminists. It's one of the things I love about this field, is that it almost entirely emerges out of the bodies of women. They were committed, these women, to accounting for the absence of women in sacred texts, the scarcity of women in religious leadership, and the impact of violence on the lives of women, many of whom drew life from their religious traditions. Although suffering has always been at the forefront of theological reflection, the study of trauma raised unique challenges to theology, both in content and form. Next slide, please. She goes on to say, the lineage of trauma theology is deeply feminist. There was no stated break from one to pursue the other. They didn't put down their feminist pencils and pick up new trauma ones. The work was entirely integrated. While we were gathered around trauma, it was our shared feminist commitments that made us think that theology shaped women's lives in particular ways and not always for the better. For many women, the language and practices of Christian faith are both wounding and healing. Feminist theologians know that faith claims can cut both ways. I found this really powerful. I consider myself as the second generation in this work. And so to hear from Shelley Rambo, who was working with Serene Jones, both of whom I would consider to be the kind of first generation of scholars doing this work, about how they understood the move into what they were doing just really confirmed to me some of the kind of instinctive connections that I was seeing in my own work. So with this deeply feminist nature and lineage in mind, I want to offer a particular insight into the feminist nature of trauma theology via the experiences and voices of 4 women named Mary in the New Testament. Thank you. Kelly Lattimore, who's one of my favourite icon makers, has just put out this beautiful image of 3 Marys, and I think that I like it so much I was willing to forgive him for not putting a 4th one in, and you can decide which of the 3 are represented here and who's the missing 4th one as we go through them. But the 4 Marys I'm going to talk about are Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the sister of Lazarus and Martha, and Mary, the wife of Clopas, who is also named as Jesus' aunt. You may know these women already. They appear in our narratives at various times in the liturgical year. You may know their stories. These are women who have become pregnant in unexpected and perhaps terrifying ways. They are women who have witnessed brutal murders of their son, their nephew, a great friend. They are women who have experienced the death of a brother. But they are also women who are interrupted and disbelieved. They are rebuked for being emotional. They are disdained for their anger. And they were afraid, but did not give up. So the voices of these Mary characters, I think, have some resonance with thinking about trauma today, and so felt like a good starting point for this. I am, for very obvious reasons, reluctant to claim that people in the biblical narrative, and indeed in Christian history, have definitely experienced trauma. Although statistically this would seem likely, and sometimes we might use the kind of 3 ruptures that I talked about just previously as ways of identifying possible trauma responses in both written and oral sources. I think it's generally a good idea to not try and diagnose people with trauma, however tempting that is. And I think here of Marjorie Kemp, who I would love to be able to diagnose in that way. So please hear me, I'm not saying that these are therefore people who've experienced trauma, but rather that their voices and experiences and their appearances in the text might help us think about trauma in useful ways. So I'm struck repeatedly by reflecting on the group of family members, close friends, primarily women, who gather at the foot of the cross as people who witness abuse and humiliation and torture and the eventual death of Jesus at the hands of Roman soldiers. The gospel narratives never tell us what the impact of witnessing such horror was on the group. Implicitly, the gospel narratives point to the resurrection as the thing which glosses over the horror of the cross. It's all okay because we know Sunday is coming. And this is ironic because focusing on the resurrection as the remedy and healing for trauma is exactly what contemporary Christians, pastors and theologians do frequently. And so Shelley Rambo notes in her book Spirit in Trauma, she says, insofar as resurrection is proclaimed as life-conquering or life-victorious over death, it does not speak to the realities of traumatic suffering. In fact, she says, one must recognize the ways in which resurrection proclamations may gloss over and negate the difficult experiences of life in the aftermath of death. The rush to life can belie the realities of death in life. The point she's making is that both liturgically and in our preaching and in our pastoral care and in our theologies, we move from the cross to the resurrection too quickly, and we forget that there is an entire day in the middle where the disciples do not know what has happened. They've not picked up on the hints. They don't know the resurrection is coming. All they know is the end of the world. And we skip through that so quickly. So she's particularly interested in the concept of Holy Saturday, and she's written about that in lots of different places, which I highly recommend that you read. So this group at the foot of the cross varies across different gospel accounts, but it's safe to say that it's a group comprised predominantly of women, made up of Jesus' close family and friends, who witness his abuse, torture, and death. They are witnesses, and witnessing has always been a vital category in trauma studies. It is through being witnessed that the person who's experienced trauma starts to construct a story about what has happened to them that might, hopefully, help make some sense of their experiences and eventually bring life where there has been death. In this sense, then, the one who witnesses, the listener, is part of the creation of knowledge of trauma. For these women at the foot of the cross, there is not only the potential that they themselves may have experienced trauma, but also the complicated reality of their transmission of witnessing to the events of the cross through their testimony to those who were not there, to us. How do we know what happened at the foot of the cross? It's through the voices of these women. So let me offer some brief vignettes of these women in order of increasing textual significance. So the first one that I turn to is Mary, the wife of Clopas. She's mentioned by name only in John 19, where she's identified as one of the women at the foot of the cross. But she might also be the other Mary who goes with Mary Magdalene to Jesus' tomb. She's sometimes referred to as Jesus' aunt, is likely a close relative. She might therefore be someone whose care and love for him and her family have brought her first to an execution and then to a graveside. It's interesting to me that this Mary's never alone. She's always seen in company of other women. And I like to imagine her as an older woman who supports her sisters through difficult times, that she's a strong and perhaps quite stoic shoulder to lean on. Although she witnesses the murder of a close relative, we don't hear of her distress. She is silent in the Gospels. Our second Mary is Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. Jesus, of course, as we know, arrives 4 days after Lazarus has died, coming too late to save him. And we don't have to read too much into the texts to know that Mary is heartbroken in her grief over the death of her brother, and she is furious that Jesus, whom she loved and who loved her, had not come in time. And so when Jesus comes to the house, she refuses to come out and meet him. When she does go and see him, she falls on the floor and weeps and rebukes him. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." She's so unafraid. And it is her tears that disturbed Jesus' spirit and deeply moved him. And so he raised Lazarus from the dead back to life. The author of John's Gospel also identifies this Mary, sister of Martha and Lazarus, as the one who anoints Jesus' feet with perfume and wipes them with her hair, an act undertaken in defiance of all convention. However, you might be more familiar with associating that story with Mary Magdalene, our third Mary, although there is actually no textual evidence to support that. But Mary Magdalene, as we know, is one of Jesus' first followers. She is the first evangelist. She stands with the other women at the foot of the cross, and she is witness to his execution. Various gospel accounts tell of how she went with Mary, the mother of Jesus, or the other Mary, to Jesus' tomb to anoint his body for burial. So Mary Magdalene is almost always seen in the intergenerational company of other women. But it's her voice I'm most interested in here, particularly what we might consider to be echoes of trauma in her voice. Having witnessed the horrific execution of her dear friend, Mary is the first witness to the risen Christ. But she is not believed when she says he is risen. I'm always perplexed at this. The disciples know her well. Why would she make up such a story if it could so easily be discredited? And why would a group of people who've spent so much time with her suddenly decide that she is a liar who cannot be trusted? It doesn't escape my notice that they are the same kinds of questions that are asked by people who've experienced sexual assault and report it. Why would she make it up? Why would everybody refuse to believe her? Our final Mary, then, is the most well-known Mary, Mary, the mother of Jesus. And her story, as we read it in the Gospels, turns on two life-changing events. At the beginning of the narrative, Mary finds herself suddenly, unexpectedly, complicatedly, and problematically pregnant. And I'm not going to argue, as some have done, that Mary was raped, either divinely or humanly. But nonetheless, I think we can imagine that this was a challenging, if not at least potentially traumatic experience for her. In the aftermath of the Annunciation, the author of the Gospel of Luke gives her the words of the Magnificat to say. And she offers then a testimony to the work of God within her. And this testimony is not just private and personal, but it is public and political too. She reframes her experience as one in which the justice of God is being made known. Some 30 years later, she watches as the child she rejoiced in God for was nailed to a cross and executed. She stands with other women at the foot of the cross and witnesses this event. A couple of days later, still with her female companion, she goes to prepare his body for burial. On entering the tomb, I'm going to read from Mark's Gospel, chapter 16 here. These women saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were amazed. And he said to them, "Do not be amazed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee, and there you will see him, as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had come upon them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Because we know the end of this story, it's really easy to overlook the very real emotions these poor women must have experienced. Because we know that the figure is a post-resurrection Jesus or an angel, we're tempted to forget the fear and distress a mother must have felt going to the tomb of her son in the first place, and then finding the grave disturbed. Strange people there, no body, and a seemingly impossible statement. Mary doesn't speak in this episode, so we can only really imagine her distress at the sight she witnesses. Maybe even renders her silent. So out of these four vignettes of the women named Mary in the Gospels, I want to offer then some features of feminist engagement with trauma theologies. Firstly, that doing this work is a place of honest confrontation with God. And I think back to Selina's words earlier on about telling the truth about church. We see this in Mary's rebuke of Jesus for failing to come quickly enough to save her brother. We see it in Mary's question of God at the Annunciation. How can this be? Feminist trauma theologies are not afraid to challenge God, to express disappointment and fury, and even disbelief at the turn of events. These theologies are constructed as they begin to overcome fear and refuse to be silent anymore, even if it is terrifying to do so. So feminist trauma theologies are honest and terrified and necessary. But they're also porous. These theologies allow space for divine interruption into faith and experience and theology. In the stories of the Marys, they often experience such interruption. Jesus interrupts their despair. He interrupts their conversation. He interrupts their experiences in order to change the trajectory or alter the perspective. So when we think about feminist trauma theologies, we're thinking about incomplete, unfinished systems of theology. Things that are open and porous and unfinished. Things that are holding on to the goods of the Christian tradition, whilst also allowing space for something new to be spoken. Our third characteristic is that of testimony. Many of the women who work in the area of trauma theology do so out of their own experiences. You only need to pick up some of the books on the back table or some of the texts within this field to find women either testifying to their own experiences or often in the kind of forward or afterward, giving an account of something that has motivated them into this work. It is a form of testimony. And indeed, taking seriously women's experiences as a place out of which to do theology is a hallmark of this kind of work. And that testimony then reaches, like the Magnificat, far beyond the personal and into the political and the public. They call for radical changes in the way we listen to people who've experienced trauma. They call for the radical overthrow of the status quo within our churches and our communities, and the rejection of these toxic cultures that do not care for all people, but rather privilege the experience and testimony of those with and in power. Our fourth characteristic is that they defy convention. Like the Marys in these vignettes, these theologies defy convention and seek to disrupt the established order. Like the Mary who wipes the oil from Jesus' feet with her hair, these theologies are not interested in the done thing or the usual way of behaving. Rather, they are concerned with the right thing as an expression of their focus on social justice and theologies that enable people to flourish. Like Mary, the mother of Jesus, who declares the divine disruption of the established order in the Magnificat, these kinds of theologies declare the concern of God for the vulnerable and the marginalized. They are unsettling, and they are also unsettlers of our theological tradition. And our fifth characteristic is that of community. The women in the vignettes that I've talked us through are rarely alone. They are almost always in the company of other women. They stand shoulder to shoulder at the foot of the cross. They go together to anoint Jesus' body at the tomb. They value extended family. Their testimonies, their voices are spoken into community. This community element is significant, and one of the reasons why many women working in the field of trauma theology do so with others as co-authors, co-editors, and co-producers of knowledge. It's a theology that is a community endeavor. Again, I'm struck by the resonances with Selena's talk earlier. So the study of trauma, and indeed trauma theology itself, has always been deeply entwined with the feminist concern that we pay attention to experience, that we take our bodies seriously as sites of theological discourse, and that we reckon with the impact these attendings have, not just on ourselves, but on our doctrines as well. In this sense, then, trauma theology is perhaps a natural inclination for those who are already committed to feminist and womanist ways of doing theology, and for what is worthy of thinking theological in the first place. In highlighting these characteristics, honest confrontation, porosity, testimony, defying convention, and the significance of community, I'm drawing out, I hope, via our biblical sisters, some of the ways in which we ourselves might do this work, wherever we find ourselves and whatever our context. Thank you.